Hello everyone. This is part 2 of chapter 12. In the last chapter, we talked about that Keynes provided us two great insights. One is the lack of spending can cause recession and depression. Second insight he provided to us was small fluctuations in the spending behavior on the part of any of the four key spending players, which are consumers, business community, government, and our net export. Is amplified and leads to big impact at the macro level. So now I'm going to introduce you a concept called marginal propensity to consume. Basically, this concept, reason we're studying this concept is this concept will show us how small fluctuations in spending on the part of four key players leads to bigger impact on the economy. So what is marginal propensity to consume? In short, we call it MPC, marginal propensity to consume. So basically what is fraction of each additional dollar. Remember, each additional dollar of income spent on consumption. Let's say you normally make $5,000 a year and somehow you get $1,000 from the government because they're trying to revive the economy and then incentivize you to spend. So let's say you get $1,000 extra. You make 5,000, you get $1,000 extra. So out of $1,000, how much you're gonna spend? What fraction? 10%, 20%, 80%? And that is what called marginal propensity to consume. And anything you don't spend of the extra income is called MPS, marginal propensity to save, MPS. So, so a marginal save is any fraction of each additional dollar of income that is saved and not spent. So let's use an example. Let's say government sends you a check of $1,000 to revive the economy. You spend $750 on that and you save $250. So MPC is 750 divided by $1,000 that you got, 0.75. So what that means, each additional dollar that you got, you are spending 75 cents. And whatever you don't spend is saved. So that is $250 divided by 1,000 is 0.25. That means each additional dollar that you got, you spend 75 cents and you save 25 cents. So keep in mind, money you got can either be saved or spent. So MPC is what fraction you spent, and MPS is what fraction you saved. In this case, you spent 0.75 and you save 0.25, which equals to $1. So keep in mind, MPC, marginal propensity to consume, is change in spending. Not your spending, change in spending divided by change in income. In this case, your change in income was $1,000 and your change in spending was $750. So keep that in mind. So now we're going to show you how application of MPC and MPS for Keynesian aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. How this particular how these two concepts are so crucial to the model developed by Keynes, which is called aggregate demand aggregate supply model. Remember, this is the model that he developed to show you or show us what causes recession and what causes depression. So let's say, imagine the economy is suffering as people are scared of their future and not spending as much as they used to. This results in unemployment rate of 10% versus 5%, which is the natural rate of unemployment. Since people are not spending, government decides to spend to get the economy going. Yeah. So government decides to spend $100 billion, and it has calculated through surveys that the average MPC is 0.8. That means if people get extra money, for every dollar they get extra money, they will spend 80 cents. And that means they will save 20 cents. So MPC is 0.8. So let's say government, now remember, economy is suffering and people are not buying. Since people are not buying, they're unsold goods. So employers are going to be letting people go because they're not able to sell goods. So government wants to get in the position of reviving the economy. So let's say government buys $100 billion worth of fighter jets from a defense company like Boeing or Raytheon. So we have three columns. In the first column, I'm going to show you government spending, which leads to income. You know, when government spends money, it becomes income for somebody else. So the next column is income and good generated. And this third is the cumulative impact. So government spends $100 billion for Boeing, and Boeing employees, there's contractors, suppliers, local government through sales tax, they get $100 billion. So they get the $100 billion, government gets the defense equipment, let's say F-14. So $100 billion worth of income is generated by government spending $100 billion. So when these people get $100 billion, these are employees of Boeing and their supplier, they in turn spend 80% of that. Remember, MPC is 0.8. That means any additional income that people get, they'll spend 80%. So these people go to Walmart, Kmart, Amazon, they go to a dealer, so they spend 80%. When they spend money, it becomes income for dealers and Walmart employees and Amazon employees. So another $80 billion worth of income is created. So initial government spend money on defense equipment, generate $100 billion worth of income for Boeing employees. Let me turn this off really quick. So government spends $100 billion. Boeing employees get $100 billion. When they in turn spend money, because income for Walmart employees, Kmart employees, Amazon employees, $80 billion. When their employees get money, they spend 80%. They create another income for other people, which is 64 billion. So this is just accumulated. The first round leads to 100 billion when the government spend money. When the Boeing employees spend money, it becomes 100 plus 80 is $180 billion. And when Kmart and Walmart and Amazon employees spend money, they spend 80%. Another income is created for people, $64 billion. So 100 plus 180 plus 64 is 244. And the process goes on and on. And if you continue with this line of reasoning, what you would see is that this initial $100 worth of spending creates income worth $500 for the economy. Either you can do this or you can employ a formula. So formula is very easy. So we have MPC is 0.8. So MPS is 0.2. So multiply is 1 divided by MPS. 1 divided by 0.2 is 5. So what that means is initial change in government spending, which was $100 billion, and you multiply by the multiplier, which is 5 in this case, the total impact would be $500 billion. And that's what we see over here. So there are two ways to figure out when the government spends money to try to revive the economy, how the impact, how the cascading impact of the economy leads to economy much bigger than the initial spending. In this case, government spent $100 billion, but the final impact on the economy was $500 billion. You know, and the reverse is true also. If people don't spend money, let's say people didn't spend like $2 billion collectively, the impact could be economy shrinking by $10 billion. You know, so this is the formula you have to remember. Impact of government spending is initial change in government spending times the multiplier. Let's say, take another example. Let's say the federal government finds out through surveys the MPC is 0.9. If MPC is 0.9, that means marginal potential to receive is 0.1. So multiply is 1 divided by 0.1, which is MPS. So multiply in this case is 10. So total impact would be initial change in government spending, let's say is $200 billion. And multiply is, as you could say, is 10. So $200 billion times 10 is $2,000 billion. So in this particular example, is MPC is zero point 0.9. Initial increase in government spending is $200 billion. So if since we already know MPC is 0.9, so out of $1, people spend 90 cents, that means they're going to save 10 cents. So MPS becomes 0.10. The multiple to consume and multiple to save is expressed in decimal. So multiply will be 1 divided by MPS, which is 10. So the final impact of government spending is changing government spending. In this case, the initial change in government spending is $200 billion. Multiply is 10. So the economy will, the final impact on the economy of government spending $200 billion is $2,000 billion. So when government is trying to revive the economy, it has two options. It can either spend the money itself, buying defense equipment or building a highway or building schools or building hospitals, or what they can do, they can send us a check to its citizen and let them spend the money. So either can government can spend money or they can give a tax cut to people. Now I'm going to show you the impact of tax cut. Now again, we're going to imagine the economy is suffering as people are scared of their future and are not spending as much as they used to. This resulting in an unemployment rate of 10%, where our goal is 5%. So government sends everybody a check. The total of those checks sent to individuals amounts to $100 billion. So imagine that government sends everybody a check, every taxpayer, every citizen. Let's say imagine every citizen gets a check. And all the checks total amount to $100 billion. And let's say government knows the average MPC is 0.8 again. So that will be MPS will be 0.2 and multiplied by 0.5. So in this case, impact of tax cut is when people get $100 billion, they're going to spend only 80%. And then this process will start, this process. So here the formula is slightly different. So impact of tax cut is tax cut, which is $100 billion, times MPC, because remember when people get their money, they do not spend all the money. They only spend 80% initially, in the initial tax cut. And then you add the multiplier. So the impact will be $400 billion. So let's just take some examples. Let's say your income is $1,100 and you spend $1,000 a week. Now government sends you a check of $50 for the week. Now your income is $50, so income has gone up by $50, but you are spending $45 more than here. So change in income is 50, change in spending is 45. So MPC would be 45 divided by 50, because 45 you're spending 50, you got is 0.9. And out of the $50 you check, you save $5. $5 divided by 50 is 0.1. So you're saving point. So every dollar that you got extra, you're spending 90 cents, is saving 10 cents. So in this case, multiplier, what we call a fiscal multiplier, which is part of the fiscal policy, is 10, 1 divided by 0.1. Problem number 2. Government spends $100 billion to stimulate the economy. So, and we already know, in this case, we are given that MPC is 0.9. What is the multiplier? So remember, first we have to figure out MPS, which is 0.1 now, and the multiplier is 10. How much spending in the first round? So remember, when government spend money, they spend $100 billion. They create $100 billion worth of income. In the second round, when people get this $100 billion, Boeing employees, let's say, they only spend 90 cents, 90%. So the second round of spending is 90 billion. And the third round is 90% of that is 81 billion. So total spending for 3 rounds is 100 billion for the first round. 90% of that is the second round. 90% of 90 is 81 the third round. That means the three rounds total income generated for the economy of the goods and services produced worth is $271 billion. And if this process goes on and on, we want to know what the final impact is. You take the initial government spending times the multiplier, which is 10, you get a 1,000 billion. Let's do one more problem. Let's say in this case, government, instead of spending, they give it a rebate. There's a $80 billion worth of rebate. No, let's go back. So government is trying to revive the economy. They have two options. They can either give us a rebate of 80 billion, so we can spend the money, or government says we're gonna decide and spend the money, 80 billion. So our goal is to figure out which has the bigger impact and what is the impact and which has the bigger impact. So what you're given is MPC is 0.9, MPS is 0.1, so the multiplier will be 10. So impact of tax rebate will be tax rebate times MPC times M. 80 times 0.9 times 10 is 720 billion. Inter-government spending is government spending times multiply 80 times 10, 800 billion. So you can see when the government spends money directly, it has a bigger impact versus when government gives a tax. Why the tax rebate has lower impact? Because remember, when people get a tax cut, they tend to save part of it and then they start spending. You know, let's take another example. We have tax cut of 1,000 billion. MPC is 0.75. So we know MPS will be 0.25. And we know the multiplier will be 4. Impact on the economy tax cut, 1,000 billion of the tax cut. MPC is 0.75 and multiply is 4. Full impact is $3,000 billion. Okay. Let's do one more now. Let's see. Let's talk about some other topics. Budget deficit. When government expenditure exceeds government income, we call it budget deficit. USA has been running deficit since 1969. National debt that you hear about is the accumulation of annual budget deficits, currently over $35 trillion. Some of the borrowing is to cover debt comes from overseas. Just keep in mind, like Japan, China buy a lot of our debt. So we as a nation live beyond our income, so we have to borrow money, just like individual, to satisfy our purchasing needs. So other countries that are running surplus, they will lend us money. Budget surplus is the opposite, when the government revenue exceeds expenditure. So we have seen some countries, they have been able to run surpluses to target debt. Norway is one example, Canada and Germany. So Mr. John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, who came with this model of agreed demand and supply, what he said was, when times are good, we should run budget surplus. When times are bad, we should run budget deficit. You know. So this particular year, we'll be running a budget deficit exceeding 2 trillion. In 2024 also, close to 2 trillion. Our biggest threat to our economy is our huge debt. According to Keynes, budget should be balanced over time and not in a particular year. Here are some of the criticism of Keynes. His model. He gives us no economic reason, but psychological reason for it. Remember, he says business community has recurring bouts of optimism and pessimism. And during Great Depression 1930, they all became pessimistic. And they stopped spending on plant and equipment, which led to the Great Recession. Why do business companies go through waves of pessimism and optimism? He does not give us a good answer. He said they're just like that. His policy gives government a free rein to spend money. Because politicians say, hey, if we're going to spend money, we're going to create jobs. So this money is being spent to create jobs. You own for citizens' benefit. His main focus is how to cure recession, but does not look into forces before the recession. All he says is that they become pessimistic. But there's another school that actually delved into this problem, and they found a really good solution as to what causes recession and depression. So this school is called the Austrian school. So according to Austrian school, central banks, through excessive printing money, set the stage for recession and depression. Forces at play that cause recession is easy printing of money by central banks. So here's the process. I have A, B, C, D, E, how this mechanism plays out for recession. Central banks print money. B, it immediately lowers interest rate. C, this encourages people to borrow and invest. D, this particular step leads to inflation. When the inflation is high, central banks get scared and then they shrink the money supply to deal with the inflation. When they shrink the money supply, interest goes up. Now, a lot of homes, mortgages, and business investment are in trouble because they were based on lower interest rate. Now they have to pay higher interest rate. And this leads to sell-off and recession. So according to the Austrian school, all the bubbles and subsequent recessions have one common denominator, and that is central banks printing too much money prior to bubble. So this school actually gives us an economic reason for recession. And what is the economic reason? Printing of money and lowering interest rate in the short run, leading to high inflation in the long run, leading to higher interest in the long run, leading to bust of all the mortgages that were based on lower interest rate and all the investment that were based on lower interest rate. So according to Keynes and his followers, multiplier is 3. This means if the government spends $1, the positive impact on the economy is $3. Some economists believe it is less than 1. The reason for less than 1 is government is very inefficient when it spends money. So it actually destroys wealth rather than create it. So here's a graph to show you how the model works, the Keynesian model works. So here's a long-run aggregate supply curve, which what the classical school believes. There's only one long-run curve. But Keynes believes that there's long-run aggregate supply curve and there's a short-run aggregate supply curve. So initially, in this particular graph, what we are showing is that we are in equilibrium. This is the short-run aggregate supply curve. This is the aggregate demand right now. This is the long-run aggregate supply curve, and this is the short-run aggregate supply curve. They meet at here A. So we have a good price level, and we have full employment. Because of excessive pessimism on the part of consumers or business community, aggregate demand goes down. Now, aggregate demand is in equilibrium at point B because this is the aggregate short-term supply curve. This is the aggregate short-term aggregate supply curve according to Keynes. So according to them, economy will settle over here. As you know, this is the employment level. Now we're settling over here. So there's a lot of, so production has gone down and we have a lot of unemployment. So Keynes believed that we need to push this aggregate demand curve outward again by government spending money tax cut to bring us back to over here. Whereas the classical school believes is if aggregate demand goes down, all the prices will go down, labor costs, interest rate, everything, and the aggregate supply will shift to this one, new one, SRAS2, and we'll be back to equilibrium at full employment. So according to our classical school, adjustment in price level creates full employment. But Keynes wants us to get full employment by pushing the aggregate demand curve. So these are some of the statistics for Great Depression. From 1929, when the Great Depression started, to 1933, money supply fell 28% due to problems in the banking system. Stock prices fell 90%, reducing consumption and investment. Economy production fell 25%, 27%. Price levels dropped by 22%, and unemployment rate rose from 3% to 25%. So this is the graph how the USA GDP declined from almost $860 billion all the way to $640 billion over this time frame. So this is a graph that I don't want to go through. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos.
Welcome to the Power of Macroeconomics. The purpose of this lesson is to first illustrate why classical economics gave way to Keynesianism in the 1930s. This discussion sets the stage for the development of one of the most important tools used in macroeconomics, the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework.
The debate between classical economists and Keynesians ranks as one of the most important in macroeconomics. It is a debate that goes back to the 1930s and the Great Depression. However, it remains a very important one even today. This is because many of the macroeconomic policies now favored by conservatives have their roots in classical economics, while those on the other side of the ideological spectrum are generally much more supportive of the Keynesian approach. In analyzing this debate, the most important point we'll make is that the classical versus Keynesian controversy is primarily a dispute over how an economy adjusts during a recession and finds its way back to full employment. On the one hand, the classical economists believe that a price adjustment mechanism would cure the economy. Specifically, they believe that in the event of unemployment, prices, wages, and interest rates would all fall. This would in turn increase consumption, production, and investment, and quickly return the economy back to its full employment equilibrium. In contrast, the Keynesian school argued that before the price adjustment mechanism had time to work, it would be overpowered by a more deadly income adjustment mechanism. To the Keynesians, when an economy sinks into a recession, people's incomes fall. This fall in income causes them to both spend less and save less, while businesses respond by investing and producing less. This reduction in consumption, savings, investment, and output in turn drives the economy deeper into recession rather than back to full employment. You can see now why this debate is so important. One school of economics, the classical approach, believes that the best cure for a recession is to leave the free market alone. This approach is also known as laissez-faire, and laissez-faire economists are those who believe that most government policies will probably make things worse, not better, so the best policy is relatively little government. On the other hand, the other school, the Keynesians, prescribes large-scale government expenditures to prime the economic pump. Keynesians typically are activist economists who believe that the government can create and implement policies that will positively affect the economy. To frame this debate, let's start with classical economics. Classical economics has its roots in the free market writings of 18th century economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and most importantly, Jean-Baptiste Say. These classical economists believed that the problem of unemployment was a natural part of the business cycle, that it was self-correcting, and most importantly, that there was no need for the government to intervene in the free market to correct it. They blamed unemployment on wages that were too high and believed that in the event of a recession, unemployed workers would be willing to work for less. Wages would then fall back down to levels where it once again made it profitable for firms to hire the workers, and the recession would end. Thus, in terms of our discussion of unemployment in the first lecture, classical economists agreed that frictional and structural unemployment could exist, but they did not agree that cyclical unemployment could be caused by a shortage of aggregate demand. Between the Civil War and the Roaring '20s, America sustained periodic booms and busts, recording no less than 5 official depressions. However, after every bust, the economy always bounced back, exactly as the classical economists predicted. That was true until the classical economists met their match in the Great Depression of the 1930s. While President Herbert Hoover kept promising that prosperity was just around the corner, and the classical economists kept waiting for what they viewed as the inevitable recovery, a towering figure walked onto the macroeconomic stage, economist John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes was born in 1883, the son of a British economist famous in his own right, John Neville Keynes. Maynard Keynes was, by all accounts, a genius who made millions as a stock market speculator. He was also a distinguished patron of the arts, a faculty member at Cambridge University, and a key appointee to the British Treasury. In 1936, with the global economy flat on its back, Keynes published the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. In that book, Keynes flatly rejected the classical notion of a self-correcting economy that would solve unemployment through adjustments in wages and prices. Keynes argued that patiently waiting for the eventual recovery was fruitless because, in the long run, we're all dead. And Keynes believed that under certain circumstances, a recessionary economy would only not naturally rebound, but even worse, fall into a deep spiral. To Keynes, the only way to get the economy moving again was to prime the economic pump with massive government expenditures. From an historical perspective, it is important to emphasize that, at the time, Keynes's approach was economic heresy. Indeed, the Keynesian prescription was initially rejected by virtually the entire economics profession. Far worse, Keynes and his followers were branded as socialists or even communists for advocating such an activist role for the central government. But to his credit, Keynes stuck to his guns, and as the Depression wore on, his teachings gained both adherents and disciples.
When the recession of 2009 hit, the federal government tried to stimulate the American economy. It cut taxes and increased spending. In other words, it conducted expansionary fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, the government's policies on taxes, spending, and borrowing, that's used to When the recession of 2009 hit, the federal government tried to stimulate the American economy. It cut taxes and increased spending. In other words, it conducted expansionary fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, the government's policies on taxes, spending, and borrowing, that's used to try to mitigate fluctuations in the business cycle, to even out the booms and the busts. But how is it that expansionary fiscal policy is capable of actually working? Imagine an economy that's operating at full employment. Workers have jobs and factories are operating near capacity. If in that case, the federal government tries to increase spending to, say, build a new road, then it necessarily has to take away some people and some capital from other sectors of the economy. GDP wouldn't increase because there's already full employment. So government spending would simply be crowding out private spending and investment. Building the new road, it may or may not be a good idea, depending on how valuable that road would be. But still, the increased government spending would not in the short run stimulate the economy. But now, in contrast, imagine an economy during a recession. The fundamental factors of production are underused. Labor and capital are unemployed or underemployed. Machines and buildings are idle. In this case, government spending on a new road probably would increase GDP. In fact, an extra dollar spent during a recession might even increase GDP by more than a dollar. Say, for instance, the government hires unemployed construction workers. These construction workers then use their new income to, say, eat out at restaurants. This causes restaurant owners to hire more workers. And these newly employed waiters and waitresses, they then spend their money throughout the economy. There's a kind of ripple effect, and the people who receive that money in turn spend more money themselves. The subsequent increases in spending caused by the initial increase in government spending, that's known as the fiscal multiplier. Now, expansionary fiscal policy is not the only kind of fiscal policy. The government also conducts contractionary fiscal policy by saving during an economic boom, by either increasing taxes or by decreasing spending. At least that's how fiscal policy is supposed to work. Later, we'll discuss some of the political economy issues of continual deficit spending and why government surpluses sometimes are so hard to come by.
And tax credits have lower multiples.
Today, peer into a world where shadowy government stooges manipulate the levers of fiscal policy from deep in their evil layers. They pick economic winners and losers and control the business cycle, creating recessions and controlling inflation to serve their purposes.
Nah, fiscal policy is a completely legitimate tool used by non-shadowy government officials to correct fluctuations in the economy. Okay, in previous videos, we've discussed the business cycle and how the economy goes up and down and up and down and up and down over time. This line represents the economy's potential GDP, the maximum sustainable amount that the economy will produce in the long run. But the business cycle shows that the economy isn't always at its potential. When actual output is below potential, economists call it a recessionary gap. Workers are unemployed and factories are sitting unused. Sometimes actual output can briefly rise above potential. Economists call this an inflationary gap. Unemployment is super low and factories are working overtime, but it's not sustainable. Eventually, producers will bid up the price of scarce resources and higher costs will lead to more inflation rather than more output. Obviously, real-life fluctuations aren't as predictable as the business cycle might suggest, but every modern industrialized economy has seen times of boom and bust. You know, you get your Empire Strikes Back and you get your Phantom Menace. So look at the real GDP growth rate in the United States since 1920. See, up and down over time. In the mid-1980s, things flattened out, and we had a thing called the Great Moderation. It seemed like the days of deep recessions and high inflation were over. Then came the Great Recession as a result of the 2008 financial crisis. Back to the same old up and down of the business cycle. Both recessionary and inflationary gaps cause serious problems. High unemployment when the economy is bad, that's bad, like really bad. And not just for the economy, for people. High unemployment rates have been linked to higher suicide rates, more domestic violence, and social upheaval. High inflation can be just as bad. Rising costs wipe out savings and have been the root of protests and riots throughout the world. Well, this seems like a fun episode. Stan, what's with all the doom and gloom? Isn't there some way to smooth out these fluctuations? I'm going to answer my own question. There might be. Many economists argue that policymakers should intervene in the macroeconomy in order to promote full employment or reduce inflation. Today, we're going to look at one of the ways to do this, fiscal policy.
The idea of fiscal policy is really simple. When the economy is going too slow or too fast, the government can step on the gas or the brake by changing government spending or taxes. In the United States, that's the job of Congress and the president. When the economy falls into a deep recessionary gap, the government can increase government spending, cut taxes, or do some of both. That's called expansionary fiscal policy. The idea is that government spending creates jobs and increases incomes for construction workers and teachers and other laborers. In turn, these workers spend more of their additional income, increasing consumer spending and boosting the entire economy. Cutting taxes follows a similar logic. A tax cut will increase disposable income for consumers. That'll increase their consumer spending and boost the entire economy.
This is exactly what the US did in 2009 during the depths of the Great Recession. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was a stimulus bill that added more than $800 billion to the economy. That stimulus was split 60-40 between new government spending and tax cuts. And the expansionary fiscal policy funded new roads and bridges and upgrades to the electric grid. And those projects created jobs.
But when the economy has an inflationary gap, the government can cut spending or raise taxes or do some combination of the two. That's called contractionary fiscal policy. That's not half as fun. The idea is that higher taxes will leave consumers with less money to spend, and lower government spending will mean fewer public jobs. All that should reduce consumer spending, cooling off the economy and reducing inflation.
We don't see contractionary fiscal policy very often in practice because politicians rarely want to hit their voters with a slower economy. It's a hard sell, and it could cost policymakers their job. US President George H.W. Bush famously stated, "Read my lips, no new taxes," while campaigning in 1988. A few years later, he agreed to raise taxes to reduce the debt and lost the election in 1992. So the big question here is, does fiscal policy actually work? Does stimulating the economy with spending and tax cuts actually, make the economy grow? That is the most heated debate in modern economics, and it's been raging for decades. It's been known to drive mild-mannered economists to use their loud voices on cable news shows. Let's learn about it in Thought Bubble. Classical theories assume that the economy will fix itself in the long run, and that government intervention will at best lead to unintended consequences, and at worst cause massive inflation and debt. These theories dominated policy decisions during the early years of the Great Depression, which saw little stimulus. Economists argued that unemployed workers would eventually accept lower wages, since some pay is better than no pay, and resource prices would eventually fall since fewer people were using resources. Lower costs would lead to more production, more jobs, and poof, the economy is back on track. At the time, many policymakers thought about a sick economy the way doctors 1,000 years ago thought about a sick patient. The thinking was that problems resulted from accumulated imbalances, which could be cured by aggressive purging. In the case of doctors, that meant bleeding their patients. In the case of a recession, that meant standing back and letting the economy bleed jobs and output until balance was restored. Then entered British economist John Maynard Keynes, one of the most influential and controversial economists of the 20th century. Keynes basically invented modern economics and developed theories and models about spending and production. He is the one that suggested using expansionary fiscal policy to speed up the economy. Keynes argued that government spending can make up for a decrease in consumer spending. So even if the economy does self-correct in the long run, there's no reason to wait it out. His justification? In the long run, we're all dead. Well, Keynes died in 1946, but his theories live on, and so does the debate.
Thanks, Thought Bubble. So at first glance, Keynesian policies seem like the perfect solution to fixing a sluggish economy. If consumer spending falls, the government can spend instead. What's the harm in that? Well, the government needs to pay for all that spending. They can't just raise taxes to cover it because that would decrease consumer spending, defeat the purpose. So to stimulate the economy, the government needs to deficit spend. They need to spend more money than they collect in tax revenue. Now, to achieve this, the government needs to borrow money, which will result in debt. And we're going to make a video about the national debt and different schools of economic thought. But for now, it's fair enough to say that the people who don't like Keynesian policy don't like it because it causes debt. More technical argument against deficit spending is that it leads to something called crowding out. If the government borrows a lot of money, that increases interest rates, making it harder for business to borrow money and buy things like factories and tools. This weakens the economy while increasing government debt. But Keynesian economists maintain that crowding out is only a problem if the economy is operating at full capacity, where all workers are employed and we're producing as much as we can. In that case, since total output can't really rise, more government spending will result in less private spending. However, they argue the situation is different when the economy is below capacity, with lots of unemployed workers and vacant factories. Now, in that case, more government spending can raise overall output by putting idle resources back to work. In fact, Keynesians would argue that government stimulus when the economy is below capacity can actually raise private spending. All those newly hired workers will start spending more money.
So how can we figure out who's right? We can start by comparing the actual performance of economies that received stimulus to those that didn't. As we mentioned, in 2009, the US government launched a huge stimulus program in response to the financial crisis. Despite that, employment and GDP both fell. That sounds like a failure, but the majority of economists think that the situation would have been far, far worse without that stimulus. And while the US was implementing stimulus, most European countries were doing the opposite. They were pursuing a policy called austerity, raising taxes and cutting government spending to reduce debt. Since 2011, when the US and European policies really started to diverge, the US economy has grown at an average rate of 2.5%, while the Eurozone GDP actually shrank by 1%. US unemployment fell to 5.5%, while Eurozone unemployment rose to 12%.
Another thing to keep in mind is that stimulus is complicated. It's hard to do well. One reason is because of this thing called the multiplier effect. The idea here is that the government spends $100 and the highway construction worker who got the money will save 50 and then spend 50 on a concert or something. The musician who got that money will save $25 and spend the other 25 and so on. So because of this ripple effect, the initial increase in government spending of $100 might turn out to be $175 worth of actual spending in the economy. Economists would call this a multiplier of 1.75. But the question is, what's the real multiplier in the United States economy? Economists have come up with a wide range of estimates for that multiplier. It turns out it depends on different situations. When the economy is already booming, the multiplier seems to be close to 1. If everyone's already working and the government wants to build a road, they're going to have to hire workers away from the private sector. Sure, public sector output increases, but private sector output falls and GDP is unchanged. It's a wash. But when the economy is in a recession with lots of unemployed workers and a lot of unused capital, the multiplier is around 2. Through that ripple effect, an increase of $100 of government spending will lead to about $200 of total spending, which puts some people back to work. Moreover, different policies have different multipliers. Spending on welfare and unemployment seem to give us the biggest bang for our buck, since people with low incomes are likely to spend virtually all of their additional income. Spending on infrastructure and aid to state and local governments also seems to have a fairly high multiplier, about 1.5. But general cuts to payroll and income taxes seem to have a multiplier of about 1. If the government cuts $100 in taxes, the economy is going to grow about $100. More targeted tax cuts and tax credits have lower multipliers, since they tend to benefit those with higher incomes who often save rather than spend additional income. But what we want is something that will affect the economy rapidly, but also have a high multiplier. So tax cuts put money in people's hands quickly, but that money might get saved rather than spent. On the other hand, infrastructure projects like making roads and bridges have strong multipliers. It might take months or even years to complete. So fiscal stimulus may be an important tool, at least when it comes to a recession. But it doesn't mean that it's easy to do or that all stimulus is created equal.
So fiscal policy has its advantages and drawbacks, but in the end, maybe it's all about that thing you didn't have when you were in 6th grade, confidence. When people are miserable and unemployed, they want to feel like help is on the way. Doing nothing doesn't create the kind of confidence that will get consumers and businesses spending again, and it doesn't get politicians reelected. So it looks like Keynesian policies are here to stay. Unless
Crash course economics is made with the help of all of these nice people.
My name is John Maynard Keynes, and welcome to ACDC Economics. Today we are going to learn about Keynesianism, the greatest thing that's ever happened in the history of mankind.
Like his ideas or not, you have to admit that John Maynard Keynes was one of the most influential thinkers in modern times. His ideas and theories have influenced the lives of millions of people. I was born in England in 1883, and let's skip all the history junk and get straight to the economics. In 1936, Keynes wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. In that book, he challenged classical economic theories that insisted that economies self-correct over time and that government involvement will always do more harm than good. Instead, Keynes focused on spending. He suggested that if consumer spending falls, then the government can stimulate the economy by increasing spending and increasing the money supply. In his book, he outlined the logical and mathematical reasoning for his conclusions, and he believed in the idea so much that he gave an often misunderstood but clearly ridiculous suggestion.
I suggested that the government could deliberately bury bottles of money and have people dig it up to reduce unemployment.
Seriously, you said that?
Quite so.
Keynes wasn't really suggesting the government should bury money. He was just pointing out the government shouldn't sit around and do nothing and wait for the economy to self-correct. Instead, the government should actively stimulate the economy.
Stimulate. I like it.
Keynes pointed out that government spending in the economy leads to more spending. Economists call this the multiplier effect. And here's the idea. When the government spends money, it becomes somebody's income, and they save a portion of that and they spend the rest. That spending becomes somebody else's income, and they save some and spend some. That keeps happening over and over again, and that's called the multiplier effect. An initial change in spending causes a ripple effect through the entire economy and leads to more total spending. And that total amount depends on how much people spend of new income. This is the idea of what Keynes called the marginal propensity to consume. The more people spend, the larger the multiplier effect. By the way, I made a video explaining this idea of geometric series and how to calculate the multiplier. It's right here. Take a look. The idea of the multiplier also explains why we have recessions. If people think the economy is going to be bad and they might lose their job, they're likely to decrease the amount they spend, perhaps going out to eat less often. Restaurant owners see their sales drop, so they lay off some workers, and these workers have less income and they buy less of other stuff, causing other workers to lose their job. Again, there's a ripple effect, but now it's pulling down the economy. To simplify, Keynesian economists believe that government spending is needed when there's a recession because the multiplier effect will mean more spending, more jobs, and hopefully more growth. But in real life, this idea of expansionary fiscal policy becomes tricky. First, there's the debate of whether it's worth going into debt to stimulate the economy. But even if economists and politicians agree to increase in government spending, how much should they spend? In the textbook, it makes it look easy, but the multiplier is difficult to calculate. And there's no way of knowing exactly how much people are going to spend. And economists disagree on how much government spending actually improves the economy. For example, there's the broken window fallacy. It's a parable created by a French economist, Frédéric Bastiat. The story goes that a boy breaks a shopkeeper's window and is praised by onlookers for helping the community, so that the storekeeper now has to spend money on fixing the window. That spending will allow the glass man to spend more money on other things in town, which will increase total spending. So in the onlookers' eyes, breaking the window was a good thing. But that doesn't really make any sense. And if it did, all we have to do to get out of the recession is break a bunch of windows.
Great idea. Perhaps we can bury the windows first.
The money that was used to fix the window could have been used to buy something else the shopkeeper actually wanted, but now that spending will never occur. The same idea applies to government spending. When the government uses tax revenue to pay for public projects and services, there's more spending in some areas, but less spending in other areas. If I give my money to the government, then I can't spend that money myself. Now, that's not really a problem if the government's buying things that I would want anyways, like schools and national defense. But it is a problem if it's going to the agency that's bearing bottles full of money. But what about if the government borrows the money? Well, even in that case, the money isn't free. If the government borrows money, then that leaves less money for companies to borrow. That could lead to higher interest rates and less investment. Economists call this crowding out. But even if there's plenty of money to borrow, there's still a problem with debt. Whatever the government borrows, eventually they're going to have to pay back. Now, I know it seems like I've been kind of mean to Keynes in this video, and that's not my goal. The goal is to show you that Keynesian policies, like all policies, have a trade-off. That being said, a lot of economists agree that the Keynesian policies of increasing government spending during the financial crisis significantly reduced the depth and length of the Great Recession. But the question is, was it worth it? Well, I don't know. Tell me what you think in the comments below, okay? Until next time.
Welcome to Essential Hayek. I'm Don Boudreau, professor of economics at George Mason University, senior fellow at the Fraser Institute, and blogger at Cafe Hayek. This video is part of the Fraser Institute's initiative to present the key ideas of F.A. Hayek in an easily accessible format. In this video, we explore Hayek's work on economic booms and busts, work for which he was awarded a Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974. One of Hayek's key observations was that when governments interfere in the economy, it results in people acting in ways that are not sustainable, which ultimately leads to booms and then, inevitably, busts. Let's simplify this idea with an example. This is Brian. Brian is a politician who thinks he has a great idea for creating jobs and widespread prosperity. With the best of intentions, Brian convinces his government to support companies so that they can develop and build factories to sell chocolate-covered pickles. But Brian's plan is flawed. He assumes there will be great demand for chocolate-covered pickles. But if there truly were great demand for chocolate-covered pickles, the pickle industry would naturally respond and build factories to cover pickles with chocolate, all without the government's assistance.
So what happens when there is no real demand by customers for chocolate-covered pickles? The resources provided by the government, whether in the form of direct support like subsidies or indirect support like loan guarantees, distorts the economy by encouraging people to make bad decisions. In this case, to use resources to make chocolate-covered pickles. As the lack of demand for these pickles becomes apparent, businesses must adjust by retooling or even scuttling factories, adjusting their production lines, changing their distribution networks, etc. All of these things mean idle resources in the short term as businesses adjust to the reality of the market. The challenge is to ensure that producers have the knowledge and the incentives to produce goods and services that people want. Government interference, such as through subsidies or, especially importantly, by manipulating the money supply, obscures that knowledge by distorting prices. This interference, by initially causing producers to tool up to produce things that consumers don't really want, inevitably results in producers having to tool down and readjust in order to better meet true consumer demands. The core insight from Hayek on economic booms and busts is that government interference, even when done with the best of intentions, changes people's behavior by changing incentives and changing signals in the market. These changes result in investments that are not sustainable and which ultimately lead to recessions or busts. To learn more and to
Hello, everyone. In this presentation, we are going to discuss the differences between Keynesian and Austrian economics. The Austrian School of Economics emanated from the Neoclassical School of Economics. On the other hand, even though the Keynesian School of Economics does incorporate many elements from the neoclassical economics, but it is also influenced by the socialist economic ideas prevalent in those times, whose other end of the spectrum was, of course, the Marxist school of thought. Since the genesis of Keynesian economics was during the Great Depression, its emphasis has been on demand. On the other hand, the emphasis of Austrian economics is on supply and productivity. Another key difference between the Keynesian and Austrian economics is that while Keynesian economics is classified as macroeconomics, since it deals with questions of demand, supply, etc., on an aggregate level of the economy, and also lays emphasis on the usage of quantitative tools to solve economic issues. The Austrian economics considers the difference between macro and micro as fallacious, as also the use of quantitative tools in economics, which it considers social science. However, what is the key difference in the economic philosophy of Keynesian and Austrian economics? Before contrasting the key difference between the Austrian and Keynesian schools of thought and economic philosophy, it is important to understand the economic business cycle. In the modern economy, where the money is fiat and credit-based, how is money created? Very simply, a person goes to the bank for a loan. The bank takes a collateral in form of an asset and voila. Money is created out of thin air. Now, as the business of that person grows and he sees more demand for his product, he approaches the bank for more loan. This time, as a result of his successful business, he has bigger asset to offer the bank as collateral and thus is able to get a bigger loan. And hence, voila, more money is created in the economy. As the economic cycle matures, some of the investments that this person has made in his business doesn't fructify and turns into a malinvestment. Also, there can be a scenario in which the money is invested in some real estate or used for some consumption. That is, no real supply is increased in the economy. As a result, even if the money supply has increased in the economy, the supply hasn't, leading to inflation. However, this is just one half of the cycle. The loan borrowed from the bank has to be returned, and with the money lost in the business, due to business contraction or some due to other form of malinvestments, like investment in assets which now cannot be offloaded at the requisite price, as a result of which the property is foreclosed, or due to money just simply spent away by the borrower in consumption. In either of these cases, the borrower is unable to return the money back to the bank, leading to write-offs and a deflationary cycle, thus leading to an economic slowdown and a recession. Now, with this economic cycle in mind, let's finally discuss the most fundamental difference between the Keynesian and Austrian economic philosophies. Now, the Keynesian school of thought suggests that to get out of a recession and on the path of economic growth, the government and central banks should intervene with a series of fiscal and monetary stimulus, that is, increasing the fiscal deficit and reducing the interest rates. This would kickstart the economy, use the ideal resources, increase demand, thus signaling the private sector to invest in growing more business, and hence then restart the economic business cycle once again. On the other hand, the Austrian School of Economics is strictly against this very government and central bank interventions. It says that the malinvestments in the economy have to clear out in a natural market clearing fashion. Essentially, the process of creative destruction must take place, and any government or central bank intervention would hamper this process. As a result, the malinvestments would not clear out, or rather, increase, causing a bigger economic slowdown in the future, apart other things like widening the wealth gap, inhibiting growth of new, better companies to replace the old ones. In fact, the Austrian economics consider the intervention by government and central banks, which leads to false price and false incentive signals in the economy, becoming the reason for a big economic business cycles. And lastly, while Keynesian economics is quite comfortable with the use of fiat money, the Austrian economics in its philosophy against government intervention in the economy advocates the use of gold or some form of commodity-based money. Of course, now with the advent of digital currencies like Bitcoin, this is an entirely new area which might lead to development of some new economic school of thought. So thanks.
Best case for fiscal policy is during a recession caused by an aggregate demand shock. But even with this best case scenario, it's still difficult to effect change. An ideal stimulus is timely, targeted, and temporary. What do we mean? Well, an ideal stimulus would quickly hire unemployed workers, putting them to work on projects which were completed as the economy recovers. This is ideal because an unemployed worker has a low opportunity cost. So that's the best time to hire. If instead the government hires a worker who would have had a job anyway, the cost to society is much greater. Let's look at each of these problems in more detail. First, timing. New government expenditures can take years to move from dream to reality. First, there's the recognition lag. It takes time to identify a problem, such as a recession. Then there's a legislative lag. Both houses of Congress and the president must approve any government expenditures. Think committee meetings, debates, drafts, complicated language, more debates, budget cycles. This lag alone could take months or even years. And once government expenditure has cleared Washington, we've only just begun. We haven't even implemented the project yet. This can involve further hurdles at the state and local level, such as selecting a firm and writing a contract to perform the work. It'd be nice if there were a lot of shovel-ready projects, but the reality is that every project requires planning, permitting, environmental review, and other delays. And then there's an effectiveness lag. It takes time for government spending to ripple through the economy. Wages, for example, they aren't paid up front on day one, but only over time. And then it takes time for the wages to be spent, and so forth. By the time that government spending is working its way through the economy, the situation may well have changed. One way to minimize lag time is to focus on automatic stabilizers, fiscal policy that occurs automatically without legislation. For example, if the economy is doing poorly, income, capital gains, and corporate profits fall, our progressive tax code could even mean lower tax rates during tough times. And that's good because lower taxes will result in more spending. Welfare and unemployment insurance also automatically kick in when individuals are hurting financially. So these payments, they're also timely and targeted. Targeted not only on the population that needs the funds the most, but on the population that is most likely to spend the money quickly, boosting the rest of the economy. Most economists, therefore, favor automatic stabilizers. Now let's turn to targeting. Ideally, we would want to hire unemployed workers, but that isn't always possible. The very term shovel ready suggests construction workers. And in the last recession, lots of construction workers did lose their jobs, but so did retail workers. And the government simply doesn't have a lot of ways to hire waiters and store clerks, at least not directly. Even among construction workers, there are big differences. A roofer, for example, who had been working home construction, they might not have the right skills to easily switch over to road construction. As a result, when the government spends money on a new construction project, that may mean hiring workers away from other jobs rather than hiring unemployed workers. Now, eventually, labor demand has still increased, but the less targeted the stimulus, the less timely and effective the stimulus. Finally, magnitude. Spending money, it's actually harder than you think. In 2015, US GDP was roughly $18 trillion. And federal spending, it was over $3 trillion. But there isn't that much discretion in the budget. Non-negotiables, things like Social Security, Medicare, national defense, and interest on the debt, they account for 65% of the budget. Authentic discretionary spending is less than 20%. And even that portion of the budget is not really all up for grabs. The 2009 stimulus, the US's largest stimulus since World War II, it was roughly $900 billion spread over 3 to 4 years. Even at its peak, the stimulus was only about 2% of annual GDP. Not bad, but not that large either. So even assuming that everything else goes right in theory and practice, it may be difficult to spend enough to fully offset an aggregate demand shock. That doesn't mean it isn't worth doing. Most studies of the 2009 stimulus find that it probably did increase GDP and reduce unemployment. In a way, this was an ideal case for fiscal policy, precisely because targeting and timeliness are less important when the recession is very severe and lasts a long time. Let's summarize. An ideal stimulus is timely, targeted, and temporary. But none of this is easy. In a severe recession, stimulus may be extremely valuable. But as with monetary policy, it's a lot more difficult than just shifting lines on a graph.
You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks by taking a few practice.
Hey everyone, I'm Mr. Willis, and you love economics. Can't emphasize economic law. Some may try, some may be loud and even sound convincing, but economic law is law. It's true regardless of whether you believe it or not. So when you hear people argue about economics, you're not listening to a debate over the legitimacy of economic law. Chances are you're listening to different economic viewpoints or opinions. These viewpoints stem from two schools of thought in macroeconomics: classical theory and the Keynesian theory. The classical theory is founded on the philosophies of Adam Smith, father of laissez-faire economics. Classical economists believe that consumers and firms make decisions in the free market economy in order to maximize their own self-interests. Consumers will make decisions that maximize their own utility, and firms will make decisions that maximize their profits. These self-interests drive voluntary exchange in the free market economy, setting price levels and quantities of output at an equilibrium where all participants can satisfy their incentive-driven goals. When fluctuations and changes occur, the natural market forces of voluntary exchange, also known as the invisible hand, allow the market economy to fix itself without outside influence or government intervention. The Keynesian theory is founded on the philosophies of John Maynard Keynes, father of modern mixed economics. Keynesian economists believe that Adam Smith in the classical theory is correct, but only to a certain point. In many ways, the Keynesian theory is an addendum to the classical theory. Keynesian economists believe that consumers and firms make decisions to maximize their self-interests, and these self-interests drive voluntary exchange in the free market economy, setting price levels and quantities of output at an equilibrium. Sometimes, when fluctuations occur, the economy will fix itself through the natural market forces known as the invisible hand, without outside influence or government intervention. Sometimes it won't. Keynesian economists believe that there are times when the economy fluctuates and natural market forces completely break down or don't do enough to correct market failures. Without outside influence or government intervention, the imperfect economic conditions will persist and the economy will spiral out of control. As a result, according to the Keynesian theory, government has a role to play to correct the economy when the invisible hand won't, and it has a responsibility to intervene to ensure the social welfare of citizens. Let's take a closer look at the classical and Keynesian theories of macroeconomics, and let's start with the classical theory. The cornerstone of the classical theory is the belief in flexible wages and prices. Flexible wages imply that workers' wages increase with inflation and decrease with deflation. According to classical economists, aggregate demand is comprised of consumer spending, investment spending, and net exports. And aggregate supply is fixed at the economy's full employment quantity of real GDP output. Changes in aggregate demand cause fluctuations in aggregate price level, and real GDP output produced in the macroeconomy remains the same because the economy always produces its potential real GDP output. For example, when consumers, firms, and foreign consumers increase their consumption, aggregate demand increases, causing inflation in the economy. As price levels rise, consumer purchasing power decreases, and so workers will ask for higher wages in order to adjust for inflation. After wages rise, consumption increases, and aggregate demand increases with it, and the economy will experience additional inflation. Eventually, demand pull inflation grows out of control, and prices rise to such a level that consumers, firms, and foreign consumers slow their consumption. Even with wages increasing, consumers just aren't willing to pay excessive prices for goods and services. Think about it. Isn't there a price you're not willing to pay for certain goods and services that you want? The macroeconomy is experiencing excessive inflation that is stifling consumption, and it's in need of correction. According to the classical theory, the correction comes from the natural market forces within the economy itself. As consumption slows, aggregate demand begins to decrease, causing deflation of prices across the economy. As the economy contracts, wages fall with price level, as firms decrease their demand for workers. Now the consumption is slowing. As aggregate demand continues to fall, consumer purchasing power increases, and prices fall to a level that consumers can't help but buy more goods and services because they are now more affordable. Because of lower prices, consumers, firms, and foreign consumers now have more purchasing power, and they increase their consumption, causing aggregate demand to increase and correcting the economic contraction. The classical theory dictates that periods of recession and excessive inflation are temporary, and the macroeconomy will correct itself through changes in aggregate demand. There's no need for outside influence or government intervention because the invisible hand works through flexible wages and prices, which affect consumption and therefore aggregate demand. According to this theory, this works every time, without failure. The Keynesian theory says that's true, but not all the time. There are times when prices and wages are flexible, and fluctuations in aggregate demand will cause changes in price level and wages, allowing the economy to fix itself, as stated in the classical theory. But there are times when the economy fails to fix itself because the invisible hand breaks down, and the only way to correct market failure and return the economy to equilibrium is through government intervention. Keynesian economists believe that there are three ranges of aggregate supply in the macroeconomy: the classical range, the intermediary range, and the Keynesian range. In the classical range, prices and wages are flexible, and the market will correct itself according to the classical theory. When aggregate demand changes, prices and wages change without real GDP changing. In the intermediary range, prices and wages begin to lose flexibility. However, in this range, when aggregate demand changes, both price and real GDP output changes, much like the short-run aggregate supply curve in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. One more thing to note: when the economy moves into the intermediary range of aggregate supply, it is experiencing a recessionary gap. Wait, how do we know that? We mentioned that the classical theory states that the aggregate economy always produces its quantity full employment level of real GDP output, making the real domestic output produced in the classical range QF. Any quantity of real GDP output produced in the short run that is less than QF means the macroeconomy is producing less than its potential. As a result, any equilibrium point in the intermediary or Keynesian range of aggregate supply means that the macroeconomy is in a recessionary gap. In the Keynesian range, prices and wages are sticky. The cornerstone of the Keynesian theory is the belief in sticky wages and prices. Sticky wages imply that workers' wages remain fixed at the same rate, regardless of changes in aggregate demand. According to Keynesian economists, when aggregate demand decreases to a point that the economy contracts and enters the Keynesian range of aggregate supply, prices have fallen so low that they become sticky and will not deflate any further. Changes in aggregate demand will cause changes in real GDP output, but prices will remain fixed and will not change. Firms just aren't willing to sell their products for lower prices because they have to make revenue or they'll be forced to shut down. At the same time, wages are also sticky, as workers just aren't willing to work at a lesser wage because they need income to spend. If consumers, firms, and foreign consumers are not consuming economic goods at this deflated price level, they never will. They may be waiting for prices to deflate a little further so that goods and services are more affordable. But that will never happen because prices and wages are sticky and they will not change. As consumption continues to fall, aggregate demand decreases, causing further economic contraction, a wider recessionary gap, and worsening economic conditions. As the unemployment rate increases and income and consumption levels plummet, aggregate demand will continue to fall. Because prices and wages are sticky, the invisible hand is broken, and the economy cannot fix itself. This vicious cycle of economic contraction will continue until either the economy collapses or government can intervene and use policy to stimulate aggregate demand and reverse economic conditions. Not seeing it yet? Okay, let's go back to the point in history where Keynesian economics was born, the Great Depression. By 1929, massive consumer spending and investment spending had driven the United States economy to a peak real GDP of $103 billion. But the economy was experiencing inflation, and personal debt and limited income began to stifle consumption levels. Combined with the massive loss of savings in bank failures and the evaporation of disposable income in the stock market crash, American consumerism plummeted, and the unemployment rate skyrocketed from 3.2% in 1929 to 8.9% in 1930. As firms closed down, the United States real GDP shrank by 10% in 1930, and the country moved into a recessionary gap. Most Americans relied on the classical theory of flexible prices and wages to save the economy. Even President Hoover did, assuring the American people that the economy would fix itself. But as unemployment skyrocketed, the national income level was shrinking at too fast a rate. And even as flexible prices and wages continued to fall into the intermediary range, consumers didn't have enough disposable income to stabilize the economy. As aggregate demand continued to decrease, firms shut down and real GDP contracted by 50%. Between 1929 and 1933, the US economy shrank by $47 billion. The unemployment rate reached 25%. The economy was in freefall. The solution to the country's economic problems was more consumption and investment. But by 1933, the economy had already entered the Keynesian range of aggregate supply, and prices and wages were sticky. As consumers desperately looked for prices to fall and consumer purchasing power to increase, prices and wages remained stagnant, and consumers were left stranded. If nothing changed naturally to correct the economy, something from outside needed to be the catalyst for growth. In steps Franklin Roosevelt and his new vision for the role of government in the economy. Starting in 1933, New Deal programs focused on direct relief, which put income directly in the hands of consumers, and work relief, which provided jobs for workers who sought steady wages. The New Deal programs would serve to provide the nation with much needed infrastructure, but also stimulate consumer spending by injecting income into the economy when prices and wages remained sticky. By 1937, the United States real GDP nearly doubled, growing from $47 billion to $92 billion. As aggregate demand increased, consumers were gaining purchasing power, allowing them to drive aggregate demand with consumer spending, as government spending continued to generate jobs and income. Eventually, by 1940, the United States unemployment rate was cut to 14%. And as war broke out in Europe, the United States became the supplier of war goods to the Allied powers. This gave American firms the incentive to take out loans and investment spend on factories, workers, and capital, causing real GDP growth and a reduction in unemployment numbers. Income levels rose, and consumer spending jumped, while net exports increased with the flow of war goods and supplies being sold to Britain and France. All in all, by 1942, the United States unemployment rate had been slashed to 4.7%, and the economy had moved back into the intermediary range. Prices and wages were more flexible, and they increased as real GDP increased. The invisible hand was working again, and by 1943, the United States economy was back to full capacity, due in large part to the stimulation of aggregate demand by Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs and the massive drive to produce war supplies to win World War II. The Keynesian theory had passed its first test and soon became the most practiced economic theory around the world. And that's classical versus Keynesian theories. Be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red button